Welcome. Thank you everyone for joining us. So we're going to go ahead and begin and people will hopefully be able to join on as we get started. So welcome to Grounded Solutions presentation. My name is Bari Dula Dube and I am the training specialist at Grounded Solutions Network based out of Washington, D.C. I will be facilitating today's presentation along with my colleague Vince Wang and our featured guest. Before we proceed, I'll tell you a little bit about us. Grounded Solutions Network is a national membership organization. We seek to cultivate communities that are equitable, inclusive, and rich in opportunity by advancing affordable housing solutions that last for generations. In today's presentation, Understanding the Performance of Shared Equity Programs, we will discuss the impacts of the shared equity housing sector over 3 decades and across 4 distinct market periods, while using the help of 2 programs to provide context. A quick note. If you're having trouble with your audio connections or you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat box on the right side of your navigation bar. I'll be monitoring the chat box throughout the session, as will our presenters. And you are all muted automatically, but at the end of the presentation, when it's time for Q&A, we will encourage you to unmute and or chat to ask questions and share comments. And when the time comes, you can unmute yourself by clicking on the microphone icon button. Just remember to mute yourself when you're not speaking to avoid any background noise on the line. And with all that housekeeping taken care of, I'll turn it over to our research manager, Vince Wang, to kick off the presentation.
Thank you, Baradillo, and welcome to the webinar, everyone. Before diving into the study, I would like to provide a bit of the background. For the majority of American households, owning a home is a dominant vehicle to wealth building. And we know that wealth is associated with a whole host of benefits, including financial security, sense of community, and improved life outcomes. Yet, the ability to afford homeownership and hold on to it is not equal to everyone. Lower-income households often face more challenges and greater risks in home owning. And among those households, people of color are particularly affected due to policies and practices that resulted in segregated communities. The disparity of homeownership across income and racial groups thus contributes to the increased wealth inequality in our society, especially during recent housing market turmoil. Nevertheless, benefits associated with homeownership are so great that for many households in the country, including lower-income households and people of color, homeownership continues to be an essential part of the American dream. Shared equity homeownership programs make homes affordable to lower-income families and keep the price affordable to future home buyers through racial restrictions. As such, shared equity programs are a promising and sustainable tool to closing the racial wealth gap. However, such premise has not been empirically tested previously. Next slide, please. To this end, with support from Freddie Mac, Grounded Solutions Network partnered with the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy and conducted a study that evaluates the performance of shared equity programs. The product of the study was published earlier this year as a working paper. It marks the largest program evaluation study to date, with 58 shared equity programs and over 4,000 housing units included. The study includes all 3 primary shared equity homeownership models, which are community land trust, limited equity co-ops, and deed-restricted housing. The evaluation of program performance was done across 4 decades, from 1985 through 2018. And the performance metrics are compared across 4 housing market periods, which are pre-housing bubble, housing boom, bust, and recovery. Next slide, please. What makes this comprehensive empirical study possible is the Homekeeper program. Homekeeper is a Salesforce app created by Grounded Solutions Network and is designed to manage affordable homeownership and housing counseling programs. Many Homekeeper participating programs opt in to share the program data in a centralized platform called the Homekeeper National Data Hub, so that aggregate impact of shared equity homeownership programs is tracked through real-time reports. If you want to learn more about Homekeeper, please reach out after the webinar. And I know that my colleague from the Homekeeper team, Val, is on the call. So if you have any questions, you can put it in the chat box and she will get back to you. For this study, we did a one-time data download last year. Thus, this is a unique set of administrative data that reflects the profile of shared equity programs in the Homekeeper National Data Hub. Next slide, please. In this webinar, as a researcher of this work, I am excited to present the main findings of this study. Even more excitingly, I'm joined today by two program administrators, Allen Carlson, Executive Director of Newtown Community Development Corporation, and Mia Walterson, Director of Homeowner Services of Habitat for Humanity, Seattle, King County. They will help ground truth some of the aggregate findings I will present and share some lessons learned from their experience. Next slide, please. This slide provides some basic information about these two guest programs. The map shows the locations of these two programs in relation to the rest of 56 programs included in the study. Both programs are CLTs, which is a dominant program type in the study, and both are middle-sized programs. Most of the 125 properties from Newtown CDC use ground lease as the legal agreement to keep home affordable upon resales. Only a small fraction of the properties are deed-restricted townhomes. For Habitat for Humanity, Seattle King County, all 142 land trust properties currently have a ground lease between the Habitat and a condo association. Moving forward, the ground lease will be with the individual. Also, the oldest transaction year documented in Homekeeper is 2002 and 1992, respectively. This suggested that both programs are old enough to reflect upon the aggregate findings across market boom, bust, and recovery periods. Next, please. So with that, let me turn the floor over to Mia and Allen. The plan from here is that we will each tell you about the program. Then I'm going to present some main findings from the study and ask both of them about their experience that related to what I have presented. Please put your comments and questions in the chat box as we go. We are very interested in to know your experience and interpretations of some of the general findings. If we don't have time to address your questions during the webinar, we will make sure to follow up afterwards. Allen, I would like to start from you. Can you please give us an introduction of the CLT program in Newtown CDC?
Hi, yes. Thank you, Vince, and thanks Grounded Solutions for this opportunity. I'm proud to say that this year Newtown is celebrating its 25th anniversary. We didn't start out as a community land trust. Newtown really started out with a small group of folks in a neighborhood and then kind of expanded to 10 neighborhoods in Northwest Tempe. Tempe's located in the Phoenix metro area. We're part of the whole big metro area. And back when Newtown started, it focused on planning and neighborhood preservation, developed some neighborhood strategic plans, and then I came to Newtown in 2000, hired as a project manager to do acquisition rehab, kind of a traditional model, buy a house, fix it up, sell it to a low-income buyer, and then use down payment assistance to make the mortgage affordable. Fannie Mae provided the funding for that at the time. At the same time I joined Newtown, City of Tempe hired a new staff person who actually introduced the idea of the community land trust model. And at that time also, the city decided that any of the homes that Newtown developed should be placed in the community land trust, which hadn't even been formed yet. And so actually, the Community Land Trust of Tempe was established in around 2001. And at the time, it was created as a separate organization from Newtown. At the time, Newtown, the executive director left. I was the only staff person. So it was started as a separate organization. We received some technical assistance through the Institute for Community Economics using HUD pass-through funds. So Newtown, Community of Tempe, and community members were involved in creating the land trust. Newtown actually developed the first houses that went in the land trust. And we learned early on that notion that build it and they will come, that simply wasn't true. We found out that there was many people who would buy a community land trust home, but they didn't even know they could purchase a home. A lot of times they lacked a little bit of down payment assistance and education. So we actually started a housing counseling program, homebuyer education, and started offering individual development accounts. And we understood then that we were developing affordable housing, but we were also developing buyers, and that it was important to show that there was demand for what we were doing. I think all of us are pretty good at talking about need and what they need and others need, but there's a big difference when you can show demand. That later helped us get funding too. Um, as I said, we developed the first properties that went in the land trust. In 2004, we actually did a statutory merger in which the Community Land Trust of Newtown merged into Newtown. During those conversations, the decision was based on the fact that we had created kind of a one-stop shop with our housing counseling and such. Um, and part of what was going on was there was some confusion. Here's these two organizations. What does Newtown do? What does the Land Trust do? So we wanted to kind of resolve that and also create some greater operating efficiencies. So through the merger, the Community Land Trust of Tempe was dissolved. It was a traditional CLT model with the tripartite board and membership organization. When the land trust merged into Newtown, it was no longer a membership organization, and at that time, Newtown changed its name also. I think on the slide you can see the Newtown logo. We used to write Newtown with a capital N, T, and N, and I have to tell you that's like really difficult to do a lot of writing and get that just right. But we got rid of that, changed our name to Newtown Community Development Corporation, and the structure of the organization at that time, then we became a CHODO, or Community Housing Development Organization. And to be a CHODO, 1/3 of the board has to either be low income, live in a low income census tract, or represent a low income group. So it's similar to the traditional CLT model, but it was still not a membership organization. 1/3 of our board members are community land trust homeowners. Actually, we have a larger percentage of CLT owners on our board now. And one of the things we really focused on was how do we create a program that really balances those competing interests of allowing homeowners to build wealth through home ownership, but still preserve the affordability. Make sure that the homes are affordable in the long term. And then another significant event along the way was we expanded our service area. So rather than just trying to do development in Tempe, the board agreed that we would look for development opportunities in the Phoenix metro area. And that resulted in us actually doing some work in Chandler, was the first city we expanded to. And I'll mention some more about that later. But I think what I'd like to do, just kind of wrap up this part, is mention our resale experience and maybe how we're different from other community land trust programs. We do use an appraisal-based formula for our resale formula. But we buy the houses back from the CLT owners. So rather than just exercise an option, we actually buy the property back and take title of the property, do any work that needs to be done, repairs, upgrades, and then we resell it to another eligible buyer. And since we've started, we've had 27 resales. The average net proceeds has been around $31,000. And the reason for that is we encourage anyone that buys a CLT property from us to use our individual development account program. And that's a program where folks can save $5,000 and get that matched with $15,000. It's basically a grant. And we tell folks, maximize the IDA program, because later if you decide to sell, it'll help offset anything that you give up in appreciation. And the other thing is, by buying the properties back, the seller doesn't have to hire a realtor and pay a pretty high commission to help sell their property. So that's how we get up to around the average net proceeds of over 30,000. So that's all I have for right now. I'll pass it on.
Great, Alan. Thank you very much. So Maya, how about the homeownership programs in your organization? I'm curious to know how your program works under the organizational structure of Habitat for Humanity.
Thank you, Vince, and thank you, Grounded Solutions, and Alan as well. Our current program is an evolution that has come through the years. Traditionally, Habitat would build homes using donated labor and donated materials. They would then sell those homes to people at the time with an income between 30% and 50% AMI. The sales price would be based upon the market value or an appraisal. And so the homeowner would have a loan which would keep their housing cost at 30% of the gross income. Any difference between that and the appraised value was covered by Habitat's silent second, as we called them. Those had a bit of a shared appreciation to them, but the appreciation would go away after 10 years. And in 20 years, our security on the property was gone. So as time progressed, the organization as a whole started realizing maybe this wasn't the most optimum use of donor money in our time, as we were losing homes out of the affordable housing market. So our current affiliate is the result of a merger that happened right about the time when the market started recovering in 2012. And when it merged, one of the three entities was using a ground lease with an association to restrict the resale price on homes and giving Habitat the right of first option. As the merger continued, the board questioned the balance, as Alan calls it, as Alan referred to, between the permanent affordability and wealth creation. In Seattle at the time, or in King County, property values were escalating right about that time as well. So the argument became relatively simple. How much wealth is too much wealth? I'll give you a quick example. When we were buying or attempting to buy, we do now buy the properties that were created using that original model, we found ourselves having to pay about $500,000 for a property. And the homeowner would realize quite a significant amount of net proceeds. So after discussion, we realized that it's important to restrict the resales moving forward. So the board has decided that any properties that we will do with a ground lease with the individual and mirroring a community land trust. I do want to make the difference, though, that the program we currently have is not a pure community land trust, in that we do not have a tripartite board. And very similar to Ellen's program, we intervene between buyer and seller. This enables us to continually invest in the program. And how we operate now is we ask our buyers to bring in a affordable first mortgage and any down payment assistance they can have, and then we finance the remaining amount with a sales price based upon the cost of construction instead of the market value. So this enables us to resell the homes to future buyers for perpetuity, is what we say. So it's a program that we started 3 or 4 years ago as a commitment, and we intend to use it moving forward. Just lessons learned. Our affiliate was one of the first organization to adapt the Homekeeper program. And when we merged, we had 340 properties and about 5 different affordability models, if there were any. And so the Homekeeper certainly has helped us sort through the complexity of our program. So I just want to put my pitch into the program. So, And the lesson we've learned throughout all this is keep it as simple as you can. Now our permanent affordability is based upon an individual ground lease with the buyer. The property sells for cost of construction, and the buyers bring in a first mortgage and down payment assistance, and the appreciation is based at 1.5% per year. Again, mirroring what the community land trusts are doing.
Great. Thank you both for the great program introduction. Next, in the next few slides, I'm going to zoom out and present aggregate findings of the study. So next, please. First, this slide shows the growth trend of shared equity homes in the past 33 years. Annual home production remained low prior to 2001. Then it increased significantly during housing boom, and high production lasted throughout the housing bust until the beginning of the housing recovery. Starting in 2014, home growth plummeted. There are two factors contributing to the total growth each year: homes from newly established shared equity programs and those added to the existing programs. Differentiating these two factors in the chart helps understand whether the sector growth is driven by new programs or by existing ones. As we can see here, homes from new programs only represented a small share in annual growth, and it mainly occurred at the turn of the century as well as between 2004 and 2010. We believe the decline in annual production during the housing recovery period is at least in part a result of shrinking funding from federal programs. For instance, the NSP Fund, Home, SHOP, and CDBG. Also, the trend reflects a shift of funding away from homeownership and towards affordable rental housing. Next. In terms of acquisition type, there are generally three forms of property acquisition for shared equity homeownership programs. Overall, nearly half of the properties entered shared equity homeownership programs through new construction. Other two types, acquisition rehab and buyer-initiated properties, each consist of about 1/4. Variation in the proportion of acquisition types exists across housing market periods. Overall, shared equity homes became more balanced across the three main acquisition types over time. And we know that 4 in 5 programs included in this study reported more than one acquisition type. Although these shifts may be attributed to external forces such as market conditions and funding availability, we think this trend indicates that shared equity home ownership programs in a sample gained experience in building portfolios through different mechanisms. As market conditions change, shared equity programs need to open to different types of opportunities. Next, please. How shared equity homes are funded is an important consideration of program growth and scalability. There is a wide range of funding source types across shared equity programs, and they can be grouped into 2 main categories. The first is public source of funding that come from government agencies, mostly in the form of grants and development loans. And the second is primary source of funding that include everything else, such as buyer savings, conventional loans from financial institutions, individual donations, and foundation grants. Overall, about 40% of property development funding came from public sources. Public sources of funding can come from any level of government, federal, state, or local. As shown in the chart, funding from state governments, primarily from state housing finance agencies, has always presented a large share of public funding across the market periods. One noticeable thing is that state funding decreased substantially both in absolute value and in percentage-wise in housing recovery period. Funding from the federal level also decreased during the same period, although not as much as the state level. With both federal and state funding sources dwindling, shared equity programs turned municipal and county governments. Local funding has grown steadily from 8% in the pre-2001 period to 19% in the housing recovery period. Nonetheless, it remains a smallest share compared to federal and state level funding sources, representing 12% overall. Next, please. Depending on the program design, the total subsidy that a household benefits from living in a shared equity home could include one or both of the following two components. Property subsidy that shared equity homeownership programs use to acquire a property, and the buyer subsidy that home buyers use to purchase their homes. The chart shows the total subsidy as a percentage of the appraised market value of the property, or subsidy depth. Overall, the median subsidy depth for sample shared equity homes is 31% for both first purchases and resales. Although the subsidy depth varies by housing market periods to some extent, it remains substantial and stays at the same level between first purchases and resales within the same housing market period. Next, please. These general findings from the study lead to my first question to Mia and Allen. That is, how do you maintain the level of funding to sustain program operation and growth? Mia, would you like to start?
Sure. Thanks, Vince. Habitat is relatively fortunate in that we have a very popular brand and well respected. So our contributions are, I want to say, at least 1/3 of our overall budget. Our budget ranges from, last year it was a little less than 11 million, so probably from 9 to 14 million, depending upon the activity and construction that we're doing. Of that, the revenue stream, 30% of it is charitable contributions, those being individuals, donors, and this is where our public or government funding fits in. We also have a relatively new revenue source in our retail operations, where we take in donations and then we resell them at a discount and use that money to help us fund our organizations. So additionally, a few years ago, our affiliate started using a third-party lending program. So instead of Habitat being the internal source of the financing for the homes at 0%, we now work with our buyers to source lenders that can provide them with affordable financing. This is now currently, last year was probably 30% of our revenue, so it's a very strong revenue stream for us. Overall, last year, we had about an 8% government funding, and it is a vital source of what we do. One of the caveats that I always like to throw in with that is compliance and any kind of funding, but especially federal or state, local funding, can be very tricky. Years ago, compliance was something that we paid attention to slightly. Now we have dedicated staff that ensure that we can meet compliance requirements before we even enter into a contract. By Habitat being intervening between buyer and seller in our model, buying back the homes, rehabbing them, and then reselling them, this also enables us to keep grasp on the compliance requirements. And we also are able to turn down funding that might not work or take money that does. So what I've noticed in working with government funding, relationships, and this is probably with any kind of funding source, relationships are critical. It's really important that we take the time to let our partner organizations, to tell them what our program is, how we operate, and just as important is to listen to what they need, so that before we get into a contract or an arrangement or an agreement, we both understand if we can or cannot meet the requirements of the funding source. So, and then as my last bullet, I just want to say again that our change to having a third-party lender program, wherein the buyer brings in a first mortgage, any down payment assistance, has been fundamental in sustaining our program and will help us grow so that we can serve even more buyers in the future.
Thanks, Mia, for sharing how your program has evolved to sustain the level of funding. As a reminder, for everyone who's listening, we would love to hear from your experience, comments, or questions. Please share with us by typing in the chat box. And I've already seen a lot of questions coming up, and sorry if I won't be able to get to it. We will have some time later after the webinar, or if we have time, we will answer questions during the webinar. So with that, Alan, what is your program's experience of maintaining the level of funding?
Sure. Thanks, Vince. Next slide, please. Yeah, so one of the things that we learned early on was that we needed to become the expert. As Maya had mentioned previously, compliance is so important. And we actually got some bad advice once about environmental reviews that needed to be done, and we got into a little bit of trouble. We didn't have to repay any funds, so it wasn't too much trouble. But the point is, in order to keep getting those types of funds, federal funds and funds from the state, it's so important to know what the rules and regulations are. And what we found that was especially important too was to spend any money that we received within the deadlines. And actually, over the years, we were able to get funds that other organizations couldn't spend in time. And because we were successful at what we were doing and good at spending the money and following the rules, we got additional funding that we might not have gotten otherwise. The other thing is, in terms of being an expert, we found out when neighborhood stabilization program came around, there was a lot of money that hit the streets, and it wasn't clear on the programming and how all this was supposed to work. And in the Phoenix metro area, HUD brought technical assistance providers to town a couple different times. And what we discovered was that many city, county staff that we worked with really didn't understand the rules and regulations. And most importantly, they didn't always understand the distinction between program income and program proceeds, and also didn't really understand the difference between a developer and a subrecipient. And so that helped us to further say, you know, we really have to be the experts on this stuff. And so we learned as much as we could, hired consultants, all of that. In terms of funding sources, we've used Chodel Home, Home Fund, CDBG, Housing Trust Fund, money from the state of Arizona, home funds from state of Arizona, neighborhood stabilization program, and land donated from city of Tempe. So those funding sources are critical, but also for us to do our work, having access to capital, and especially low cost capital. In 2004, we got a EQ2 equity equivalent investment from Wells Fargo. The first one was $150,000, and a few years later we got $300,000. And it's really an investment in the organization. They just cut us a check. We paid 2% interest only on a quarterly basis, and we used that money to acquire properties. It really allowed us, during boom times, to compete with investors who were buying properties for cash. We could compete with them. Just recently, well, we paid off the Wells Fargo EQ2s. Just recently, we got another EQ2 from Enterprise Bank and Trust, $250,000. Also important is we had a couple credit lines with local banks that we could get loans on the properties that we were buying. Arizona Community Foundation here has a zero interest recoverable grant program. We a couple times got $75,000 from them and repaid it. And then another game changer was in 2005 we received the Bank of America Neighborhood Builders Award, and that was a $200,000 grant without really any strings attached, $100,000 per year for 2 years. And we were able to use those funds to hire a housing development manager. And as Maya also said about the importance of relationships, I just wanted to say that our relationship with City of Chandler was such a great relationship and a great opportunity. And the main staff person there that we worked with, I always remember her saying that she had learned a long time ago that one of her main roles or jobs as a public servant was to be a problem solver. And so, rather when problems come up, getting upset or whatever, she would always say, well, it is what it is. Let's figure out a solution to this. Let's figure out how to fix it. And, that kind of an attitude was just, it really helped us to do what we were doing and be successful. Our first NSP contract, she actually inherited that contract, that state staff person, but there were so many problems with our first NSP contract. The city ended up getting a TA provider through HUD. Newtown hired a consultant. We worked with city staff and the city attorney, and we actually were able to create the model that we use in other cities now. We developed a developer agreement that was understandable, that protected our interest. One of the things we learned was the importance of making a distinction between the affordability period through the ground lease versus the affordability period required by federal funds. So we made that distinction. So that relationship with City of Chandler and the staff there was just so important to us. The other thing is City of Tempe. We've worked with them for years since we started. There's new staff person there who's just very enthusiastic about the community land trust model. Very much just very ambitious about wanting to create affordable housing. And that's another great relationship. We're working on a project now where we got some land from the city and we're building 13 600 square foot 1-bedroom lofts. We call it our Tempe micro estates. They're not really tiny homes because they're bigger than tiny homes, but the project will include a 900 square foot community room and a common area also. So, and I think the other thing in terms of funding are fees. When we buy a property back and resell it, we usually earn a pretty decent developer fee for doing that transaction. So I think that's all I have for now. I'll pass to the next person then. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. So now please allow me to continue sharing some of the general findings. Next, please. In terms of racial ethnic composition, this study finds that overall, the majority of shared equity homes serve white non-Hispanic families. It must be noted that this result is biased because the largest CLT in the nation, Chaplain Housing Trust, is in a study. In fact, 1 in 5 observations come from Chaplain Housing Trust, and it serves an area that is predominantly white non-Hispanic population. Regardless of this bias, an important trend is that the share of minority households has steadily increased from 13% in the pre-2001 period to 43% during the housing recovery period. During the housing recovery period, the racial composition of households in shared equity homes became similar to that of homeowners with the same income level and living in the same state. Next, please. Shared equity models are often considered to function as a transition from renting to home owning. Therefore, in the hope of promoting socioeconomic status for program participants. In this regard, many programs either give preference to applicants who are first-time home buyers or only accept first-time home buyers. In a sample, we find that 69% of families belong to this group. The share of first-time home buyers increased significantly from only 41% prior to 2001 to 70% during housing boom and remained that level since then. Next, please. Shared equity models are created to make homes affordable for lower income families generation after generation. This slide proves that the affordability premise is true. Two important takeaways from this chart. The first is that 95% of shared equity homes are priced affordably for lower income families, defined as those that have incomes below 80% of American area median income. In addition, nearly half of the shared equity homes are affordable to very low income households who have incomes below 50% of AMI. Secondly, affordability is achieved across all housing market periods, as well as for both first purchases and resales. Next. Shared equity programs are designed to balance wealth building with lasting affordability. This slide estimates that the wealth accrued by program participants between their initial purchase and resale of the property, and to understand whether and how wealth accumulation changed across market periods. For the median household, the combined wealth accumulation is approximately $14,000, with small variations across periods. By comparison, the median equity investment at purchase is only $1,800. The amount of wealth accumulated is somewhat lower for sales that took place during the housing bust and recovery periods, but it remained substantial. The wealth accumulation includes two components: the mortgage principal repayments with a median of $8,500 and the net appreciation of homes between purchase and sale with a median of $3,300. Risk associated with homeownership remains, as evidenced by the negative net appreciation for a typical shared equity homeowner during the recovery period. Declining net appreciation is offset by increasing principal payments due to longer holding periods and the larger mortgage in recent years. Thus, the combined result is that the sellers still overwhelmingly experience an increase in wealth during all housing market periods. Next, please. The tenure decision of program participants who moved is an important indicator of how shared equity programs promote upward mobility. This slide shows that the majority of movers purchased a new home after selling their shared equity homes, regardless of the housing market period. About 1 in 4 movers moved into rental market. The uptick of share in the other living conditions category reflects that people became more likely to choose various temporary living arrangements in recent years. Next. So of all these general findings, the finding about shared equity programs increasingly serving people of color stick with me. And I'm curious to know from Allen and Mia how your programs are designed and administered to serve communities of color and immigrant populations. So Allen, the Homekeeper Hub data indicates that more than half of home buyers in your CLT program are households of color, which is higher than the national average, as well as the share of minority households in your service area. What factors do you think contribute to your program serving higher percentage of minority households?
Yeah, Vince, I think there's a couple of factors in play here. Next slide, please. And so we focus on low-income populations, and I think one of the things that we see is that there's generally a higher percentage of racial ethnic minorities in the lower-income populations, and our focus on these populations. Part of how we reach these folks is through our relationships with other programs. A big one is the Family Self-Sufficiency Program. We work with the FSS programs in the various cities around the Phoenix metro area. And what we find is that this, of course, is a group with, all the folks in that group are low income, and there's a very high percentage of racial and ethnic minorities. The other thing is that we are willing and we do work with folks on a long-term basis. We know that some folks might not ever be ready for home ownership, but we'll still work with them to provide counseling and financial coaching help them to build their credit. And in that way, we really see our community land trust program as being a component of kind of a continuum of services that we offer to help people increase their financial well-being. It's good for the families, individuals we work with, good for the communities, really developing buyers in that pipeline. And then again, I mentioned the individual development accounts. I know we had one client who had saved for 5 years and had some family issues come up and spent her money and started saving again, and ended up buying a land trust house from us, and used the IDA program. And I think another factor is having access to good loan products, and bilingual loan officers. U.S. Bank has a product that is very similar to the FHA product, but it is compatible with land trust. It doesn't require a credit score. You do have to have a decent credit history. And so we can help folks develop a good alternative credit history, but access to good loan products. And then having bilingual staff. We have 2 housing counselors that are bilingual, speak Spanish and English, and our receptionist speaks Spanish. And we noticed a couple years ago that many of the folks that we were working with were Spanish speaking. So we actually made it a requirement, part of the job description for our receptionist, that person has to be able to speak Spanish and be bilingual. So that's helped a lot. And I think also we have a diverse board of directors. That's been the case for a long time at Newtown. In terms of our board of directors, we have 17 on our board right now. 8 of those are community land trust homeowners. 8 are women, 9 are men, 6 are racial or ethnic minorities. So kind of all through the organization, we have that diversity and support that diversity. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Alan. This is really helpful. So now I would like to turn to Maya. So Maya, data shows us that the share of minority homeowners in your program increased from 31% during housing boom period to 89% during the most recent housing recovery period. Can you tell us what factors you think contributed to the remarkable increase of minority households in your program?
Sure. Thank you, Vince. So I think, our outcomes are very similar to Alan's, in that the people who are in lower income are generally a higher proportion of people of color. So there are some demographics that play into that successful growth. However, early on in the Habitat Seattle affiliate, they made a concerted effort to reach the underserved populations in King County. And as a result, when we merged, we adopted that same type of methodology where we keep our connections in the community. We consistently meet with our partners and the different organizations in the various neighborhoods to ensure that the people know we're here. That resulted in what I consider kind of an organic momentum, in that when we sell to one buyer, that buyer shares that knowledge with the people in their community, and that keeps our pool growing. So we've discovered it's really important to always be outreaching, always be working within the community to tell people what we do. The minute we drop that outreach process, our momentum slows down, and we're not reaching the people that we want to reach. So we've told ourselves that we will keep a seat at the table in the various organizations. Now, having said that, one of the things that we're working on is to diversify both our staff and our board. We have diverse homeowner services staff, Hispanic speaking in our selection committee, and we're now looking to diversify our board into more of a demographics, the people that we are, our clients, and in the county itself. So another thing that we have implemented that we're just in the process of reinforcing is offering translation services in outreach. So for example, we'll meet with people that the organizations of, say, Hispanic speaking or Amharic speaking or whatever the community organization might be, and we bring a translator to that meeting and let people know what it is we do, so that when we do have homes for sale, we have at least have done the hard work. The Habitat program can be a very complex program, so we've learned that we have to repeat our messaging over and over. And so by doing the first outreach to the people who, the ESL families, we're starting that messaging. And then we just continue that. When we do have homes for sale, then again, we reinforce our community outreach. So that's what we're doing.
Great. Thank you both for sharing your experience. So that's all we have. Now I would like to turn it back to Baridilo.
Thank you. To follow up that wonderful presentation, I want to highlight a few resources and opportunities that we'll be including in our post-webinar email. And while I'm doing that, I want to let you all know that since we didn't have a chance for Q&A regarding today's content, please feel free to start putting questions in the chat, and after I go through all the resources, we will try to get through as many of those as we can. So, for our first resource, we will be sure to include a copy of the report we discussed, Tracking the Growth and Evaluating Performance of Shared Equity Homeownership Programs. Next, I want to share with you all the benefits of becoming a member with Grounded Solutions Network. As you can see, there are a variety of reasons to join, including discounted access to our online training institute, scholarships to conferences and in-person trainings, and so much more. If you are not yet a member, if you have not renewed, we encourage you to join us and learn more by visiting groundedsolutions.org/membership. Next, we also hope that you will join us for in person for two very special events in Georgia next month. The Reclaiming Vacant Properties Conference will be in Atlanta, Georgia, October 2nd through 4th. And the 50th anniversary celebration of New Communities, Inc. will be in Albany, Georgia, October 5th. Again, for more information, please visit our website. Next, if you found today's webinar to be helpful, we hope you'll join us for future learning opportunities as a part of the Online Training Institute. Our next training course will be the Affordable Pricing and Resale Formulas course, and registration is currently open. We also have several planned for this upcoming spring, including CLT Basics and Beyond, Post-Purchase Monitoring, Compliance, and Stewardship, and Program Design and Implementation, a Municipal Perspective. We have a number of discounted registration scholarships still available, so we encourage you to visit groundedsolutions.org/events to register for one of our online courses or trainings and to apply for a scholarship if needed. Lastly, as I said earlier, after this call, you will receive an email with the call recording and a few other helpful resources. Included in that email is a quick survey that should take you no more than 2 minutes to complete. Please take a few moments to share your feedback on the session to help us to continue to improve our offerings. Now, we are going to stay on a bit longer to answer any questions you have regarding the content, so feel free to chat your questions or even unmute yourself and ask away. Thank you for coming.
So Alan, this is Vince. I believe that there's a question about what you mentioned, the distinction between program income versus program proceeds. Can you please explain that a little bit?
Sure, Vince. Yes, so program income, generally it's a technical distinction when you're using CHODO home funds, or CDBG. So in our case, our developer agreement says that we're able to keep the program proceeds and use it for additional projects. With program income, that has to be returned. Also with project proceeds, If you receive proceeds, put the proceeds into another project and then have proceeds again, then those are no longer federal funds. And depending on your agreement with the PJ, you could keep those proceeds. I hope that explained it pretty well.
So I see a couple more questions in the chat box. So Charlie, first of all, yes, this will be recorded, and as Bardillo mentioned that after this webinar, we'll send an email with that recorded message in there. So Andrew, a great question about Champlain Housing Trust being so successful. I think it's a lot of, it's really a combination of a lot of things, and it's been out there for such a long time. You know, local-wise, I think the political environment, the support from various places, and their partnership with both the city and the nonprofits locally are so important. And there are, of course, other aspects of it, but it is the largest CLTs in the nation. And Martin, I see your question about the affordability term. I think my colleague Emily is here, and sorry, Emily, to call you. I think you have a great explanation. I know you have a great explanation to that. Can you please help answer if you're still in?
Hi, Vince. This is Emily. Can you restate the question?
The question is about affordability terms. So it's about CLT homes are affordable in perpetuity, yes, or at least based on a 99-year renewable lease. And that's it. I think the question was about why we use 30 year as the benchmark or the cutoff to determine bias or sample size in our study.
Oh, great. Okay. Yeah. So we considered programs that had 30-year affordability terms because in many states, there are rules against perpetuities, which means that you cannot have a deed restriction that lasts longer than a 30-year period. And so because of that, as long as programs also had the intention to be preserving affordability over resales, they ensured that they had the right of first refusal. They ensured that they were using a resale formula that was intended to keep the property permanently affordable, sale over sale. And that's why we ended up including those programs, because that's often how shared equity homeownership has to be designed when you're using a deed restricted covenant.
Thank you, Emily. And I'm just reading aloud a question, maybe for both Alan and Maya. So our appraiser plans to reassess all properties using a land lease in 35 years here in California. Does King County or Phoenix area have this issue? How does it impact these CLTs?
Vince, I'll jump in here. The appraisal issue, as I understand it, and there probably are other people who could speak to this better than I, it's an issue in King County or in many areas because of the way appraisals are done with community land trust properties. I think some of the rules there are that they're not supposed to compare them to fair market value. And the calculations they do, I believe they take the fair market value and then reduce the value equivalent to what the lease is on the property. So I think there's some formulas in there that matter. So anyway, it's a topic that I know the community is discussing here in Washington. Don't have any answers, just acknowledgement of the issue.
And I'm seeing more questions from the chat box. Cindy, in answer to your question, yes, our research determined the percentage of CLT homeowners who actually sell their homes. And we do look at the average length of time they stayed in the CLT homes. Well, not CLT particularly, we do look at all 58 shared equity homeownership programs as a whole. And we found that in each market periods, the length of stay became longer. So I believe it was like 5 years in a housing boom, about 6 years in housing bust, and in the most recent housing recovery period is about seven some years. So between 7 and 8 years on average. And to Justin's question, what is the most efficient way to convert CLT proceeds into adding properties into the CLT? Maybe that would be a question that Alan can help answer.
Yes, I'm not sure if I understand the question exactly. Convert CLT properties into adding additional properties. I would say this, with our contracts, we get to keep the proceeds and roll them into the next property, and that's just part of our contract. I think anytime you're dealing with proceeds, if it's from federal funds, it has to be in the contract as to what you can do with the proceeds. And one of the things that we're always sure to do is to add, especially in our total home contracts, that we can use the proceeds for any eligible home activity with the city's prior approval, but it has to be part of the contract.
So Charlie asked, reassessment of land lease properties in 35 years. Do people see that as a national trend? I'm not quite sure about what that means, Charlie. Maybe can you unmute and explain it? Or if you're not able to do so, you can feel free to explain it further in the chat box, and hopefully we'll get back to you.
Hey, Vince, this is Alan. I'm curious about the issue of reassessment. So is that reassessment by the tax assessor or an appraiser for the organization? I know that we're currently in the process of getting our annual audit done. And what we've done in the past, when we buy a property back and resell it, we get an appraisal. And if the property, the land value has increased, we have booked that increase or if it's decreased it. We're being told by our auditor that you can't really do that. So we're kind of working through that issue right now. So, okay, so I see in the chat box it says the county tax assessor reassesses any property after 35 years. Oh, to market rate. Okay, interesting.
Well, I guess that's all the question we have. Before going, I will make sure that, you know, after today, I will go through all the information in the chat box and make sure that we have answered all the questions. Well, as I said, there's more questions coming. And do you see that discussion among tax assessors a national trend? So we don't have that data, so I cannot say anything but I think that would be a good topic to explore in the future. Sorry for my confusion question. Justin mentioned by efficient, do you have any tips on how do you reduce transactional costs associated with the resale? And I guess that's a question back to Alan.
Sure. Well, I would say when you mention transactional cost, then transactional cost to the seller and transactional cost to the buyer. In terms of transactional cost to the seller, in our case, we buy the properties back and the seller doesn't have to hire a realtor and pay a large commission. So that's one way. In terms of buying properties back, I know in our case, if we use our line of credit and use a bank loan, then the fees for that transaction to the bank are pretty significant. So when we're able to and we buy properties back, we use cash. That helps keep the transactional cost down.
Any more questions? Oh, thank you, Beth. I just saw you answer the question for Justin. Okay, Stacy just put one. Last year, the newly formed California Community Trust Network succeeded in developing and supporting passage of Assembly Bill. Great. Thanks for sharing that information, Stacy. And I guess that's all the question we have. And again, if I see any more unanswered questions in the chat box, I will make sure to follow up. Again, thank you all very much for attending. And Bardil, do you have anything else to say?
Yes, once again, thank you everyone for attending our presentation. And again, all of these, the recording and the resources will be included in the post-webinar email. Awesome. All right, well, have a good day, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.